Hi everybody, Matt Yonkovit here with a Percona Live talk. Thank you for joining us at Percona Live today. I'm here to talk to you about the 10 open source databases trends that are probably already impacting your infrastructure today. But they're going to be impacting you over the next few years in general. So wanted to talk to you specifically about that, and let's jump right in. As an introduction, this is me. I am Matt Yonkovit, the head of open source strategy here at Percona, or the HOS for short. You can find me at Matt M. Yonkovit at Twitter. You can also email me at hos@percona.com or matt@percona.com. And you can check out our podcast, The HOS Talks FOSS, which is available on all podcast apps and on YouTube as well. So if you like this, go ahead and follow us there and check out all the great content that we've got. So I wanted to start with probably the most impactful thing that is happening in the open source space and the database space in general. And that is that databases are boring as crap. Okay? They're dull. They're not cutting edge. Oh my God, when you talk to developers about databases, they fall asleep. It's what they listen to. They listen to database theory, on their iPads to try and cure insomnia. Well, I don't think that, but there are many people who do think this, and it is a trend that is impacting everything else that we're talking about here today and everything else in the database space. So first, I want to say thank God that databases are boring. Okay? Seriously, it is good that databases are boring. You need to understand that. And the reason is there are some things you just don't want to be exciting, right? How many people have ever wanted to come back from a plane trip and, your significant other, your partner says to you, "Hey, how was the trip?" And you say, "My plane trip was exciting." Yeah, if you're going to go somewhere fun, you want the trip to be fun, but you don't want the plane ride to be an exciting plane ride. Same thing with tax season. We just had tax season here in the U.S. You don't want an exciting tax season. Same thing with a doctor's visit. Not fun to have an exciting doctor's visit. So you really want to avoid walking into a scenario where you really want something to be very routine and boring, and then all of a sudden have it be the opposite of that. Avoid that at all costs. So the biggest thing that I see that's impacting all of us in the database space is that this thought process, especially by developers, especially by IT management, that databases don't matter. Okay? I'm not saying that this is a true trend. This is not my words. This is the words of other folks who are out in that space. And so there is this strategy that they're just going to trust and hope that, hey, it's just easy to ignore the database space. And it gets back to that uncool factor, if you will, on why databases are boring, right? They're uncool. They're not interesting. Developers, managers, how many people think about infrastructure? They just don't, right? It's something that they don't want to think about if they can avoid it. Because it's kind of like building a house. How often do you think about your plumbing, right? You take for granted, the plumbing in your house. You go build this new house, you build this beautiful thing, you set it all up the way you want it. You get the granite countertops, you get the appliances that you want, you get it all wired for, internet. It's all spectacular. And, how much time and effort do you think about the plumbing other than, I want the sink here, this is where I want the bathroom, I want this type of shower. You're not thinking about, is the flow right? Is this right? You just expect it to be done. The problem is when you think about it, it's really when you have that kind of like revenge type thing in the plumbing space. And it's the same thing, when it happens in the database space, right? And so that's where you've got to have people you can call and rely on to help build, but also fix and maintain that database infrastructure. And in this case, having a boring plumbing system that just works is good. It's the same thing. Having a boring database that runs well is good, and you can't take that for granted. But too many people just take for granted that, it's just going to happen behind the scenes. It's just magic, right? Let's bring the magic, and see what happens. But be afraid of those exciting databases and events, and be mindful that you want to avoid them at all costs. And you really need to make sure that you are building that infrastructure to take in mind that you want to avoid the outages, slowdowns, and security issues. Because these are the things that make your databases exciting, and you don't want that level of excitement in your life. You have other things that you want to focus on. Now, everyone who is pushing for this, movement towards databases are boring, they all want something to just handle the databases for them. And that's where you're seeing this give us control movement in the database as a service environment, right? Cede control to a cloud provider or to your database vendor, and all of your problems will just melt away, right? It's really about passing the buck, right? Making the boring, maddening database problem someone else's issue to deal with, because let's be honest, everyone wants to focus on their applications. They want to focus on generating really, a lot of value. So, let the plumbers handle the plumbing, right? I mean, it makes sense. But the promise of this is really, really compelling on a lot of levels for people, right? Because you can focus on that innovation. You can reduce your costs. You can scale up quickly. You can forget about hey, is the plumbing working? And there's some really big advantages to that. But the issue that most people assume is that by automatically just moving to this cloud space and moving to databases as a service, that all of the problems that you had go away. But the thing that you have to realize is it may reduce those problems, it doesn't eliminate them. And so you still need to consider how you're going to handle these problems, right? 66% of people in our survey that we did last year of over 700 IT developers, DBAs, and infrastructure folks came back and said 66% who are running databases as service still had performance slowdowns. 39% still had outages, and 18% had higher than expected costs. So just because you've said, I'm going to make this someone else's problem, doesn't mean those problems go away. Sure, they'll reduce it, but there's only a certain level that those providers go to, and you need to understand where that level is. Now, also part of this movement to kind of, push out people's responsibilities and make sure that you're innovating faster is this movement towards distributed control, letting the developers, or the architects manage and maintain and choose a lot of the infrastructure and what's in that stack, right? What the components are. And so the question is this a little bit like letting the inmates run the asylum sometimes? Because you have people who aren't really well versed in database, infrastructure, hardware, the systems themselves, sometimes picking things just because they're easier to use from a development standpoint. And, we've really seen this movement over the last few years where the king of, decision making around this is really coming from that developer architecture type team. In fact, our survey data shows that 68% of database technology choices, which databases you use in any application or in any environment, come directly from engineers and architects. It's not coming from the DBAs. It's not even coming from management. It's not like some on high decision that is, hey, we're going to be a SQL Server shop or an Oracle shop. No. This is a development team is building an application, and we've decided that we're going to write it in Python, and we're going to use MongoDB, and we're going to use, React or something, and they're going to pick those components based on how fast they can move and if they can meet the right needs, which is great for an innovation perspective. But it is difficult for others to manage that, because what you end up having is an issue with what I call the IT inheritance issue, where now all of a sudden the people who have to maintain the infrastructure, they're getting handed to them. And it's handed to them after the fact. And they don't necessarily know how to manage that. Now, we've got this movement where now you've got developers, you've got architects who are designing these infrastructures for you to run and use. At the same time, when the demands to keep more data is just increasing at an exponential rate, right? There is no company out there who is saying, let's do less data, let's store less, let's get rid of stuff we don't need anymore. It's all about more, more, more. And that is an entirely different philosophy than you might have had years ago even. And so this drive has led to a lot of new databases, but it's led to a lot of new innovation. And, part of this is, this push that everything needs to be kept. Think about for compliance reasons, right? Every, company now has to maintain a certain level of data for compliance reasons. But not only that, there could be potential data that you want to use for machine learning or AI or analyze later on. So we become digital pack rats in this environment. But the problem that you run into is the more data you have, right? The more large data sets, the more demand you have for real-time data analysis, okay? It doesn't come with expectations that you can be slower to respond. In fact, to get the data and to get your results, it's quicker responses required. And so you've got this kind of moving together of two pieces where I need more stuff. So instead of a terabyte, I need a petabyte. But I also need it sub-second response time. And those two don't necessarily go hand in hand. And those expectations are things that you're going to have to continue to deal with, and they're just going to get worse and worse. Now, fear not. Every vendor out there has their solution to these problems. And that's where a lot of vendors are coming up with new technology. But a lot of these vendors are trying to figure out new ways to not only provide you with value, but provide you with value in such a way that you'll get hooked and get locked into it, right? And so locking into a vendor is not something that, most people think a lot about, but there is a massively fierce competition for developers in the cloud and tech and database space right now. And you'll see this. There are hundreds of jobs for DevRel people and for people who can speak to developers and show them how to do things really cool. And there's a ton of companies that have adopted the open source mantra as a gateway drug for developers to get in there. Now, if you remember what I talked about a few minutes ago, the trend is developers and architects get to pick these solutions. Once you pick the solution, you built an application on it, it's almost impossible to get rid of it. So if you can convince developers that your tool, your database is the best database for their job, and they start developing with it, the likelihood that that company will still be using your technology in 3, 5, 10 years is quite high. And so you start to see this move where you start to see these little things start to crop up in the technology space where it's, hey, this is really geared for the developer. Look how easy we can make this. And you'll see a lot of flowery language around developer type marketing material where it speaks to their pain points, right? This is schemaless. You don't, it's unstructured data. You don't need to ever worry about how it's structured. Oh, and, we'll run it for you. We have the best practices in mind for the database. Focus on your application, not anything else. Because as you move towards these vendors, it is more likely that you will get locked in and stay with them for a long, period of time. In fact, analysts in the Wall Street market love this. In fact, this is this quote, from an analyst and a journalist from about a year ago, where they talk about the risk involved in switching databases. And this is especially true if your application is very locked in. And if you've outsourced to a vendor the management of this, the likelihood of you moving is very limited. So it makes good investment, purpose for you to get locked in. But does it make good business sense from a company perspective to get locked in? And I believe in keeping control of your own destiny and being able to choose where you want to go. And so there is this odds because, once you get locked into a place, moving out is incredibly difficult. And let me give you an example of this. This is not just an IT problem. Okay, this is not just with infrastructure or code. this is also an issue that exists across the industry. Now, there was an article in Wired just recently about McDonald's ice cream cones. Now, I don't know how many people here are familiar with McDonald's ice cream, but it comes in this soft serve machine. You go in, they've got like a machine, they pull the handle and, it comes out into this nice little shape here. Now, the interesting thing about McDonald's ice cream is probably 1 out of every 3 days it's broken, and so you can't get ice cream, and it annoys everybody. But I did not know this until this article that came out, that McDonald's forces all of the people who, pay for their franchise, McDonald's franchise, to buy the machine from them and have a support contract with one particular vendor. And so every time that machine breaks, you have to call the vendor and they come in and they fix it, because you have zero ability to fix or, to do anything to try and get your ice cream machine working on its own. And so they've built in this kind of like dependent. Now, a company, one of the franchisees was playing around with the thing, waiting for the maintenance people to show up, and they found a secret menu within the ice cream machine that basically allowed you to fix it without calling someone and paying the fees to have someone come out and fix it. And it was, oh, look, I can make this a creamier ice cream. I can make it colder. I can make, the consistency better. And like all of these things are there, just no one has access to it except for a maintenance guy who comes out. And this issue, prompted this company to develop a tool that you can get on your smartphone and you can reset, your ice cream machine, which seems incredibly valuable because you're losing money every time you can't sell ice cream. So the issue is it breaks that dependence model. And so now there's threatened lawsuits, there's, all kinds of negativity. McDonald's is threatening franchises over, don't use this device because you'll break your licensing agreement, all this fun stuff. Because that lock-in exists not only here, but elsewhere. And it's a good business model, right? It's a good business model for the shareholders. It's really bad for kind of the middlemen or those using those devices. Now, another trend we're seeing is, not only are you enabling your developers to do more, and vendors are more than happy to give you the tools to do that, developers are building things in new ways, right? Developers are looking at this cloud native, type of thing. And it's a buzzword that is leaving a bad hangover for a lot of folks. But this is where you're seeing the shift in infrastructure to be focused on managing a herd of systems. And what I mean by that is, as opposed to having, back in the olden days when dinosaurs roamed the earth and I was a DBA, which seems like forever ago, you used to have a database system, maybe a few database systems. They shared, some common components. But even like big environments, maybe 100 databases, 100 servers. I mean, that's even pushing it. This is pre-Blade. You probably had these big irons and, you had different databases on the same hardware. And so you manage those in a way that, was very manual, but, you developed some scripts and stuff, but it was still, there was a limited number. And so you could say, oh my gosh, server 102.60 is down, and you would know what that is. Now, every application wants its own database. Every microservice wants its own database. And so now you don't know how many servers you have. You could have thousands, you could have, tens of thousands of, containers that are running databases, different applications that are connecting, and they're transient and they come and they go. It's all kinds of craziness. And this is where vendors are also starting to key in on this. And this is where you start to see the serverless movement come into play as well, because they're trying to plug into this elasticity, if you will, of the databases and these microservice environments. So again, how do we get you to rely on us? Well, don't worry about databases. Just have your application call our proprietary API and we'll add the databases for you. Now, of course, as all this is going on, there's a few enterprising, black hat folks on the dark web who are looking for your data, okay? And, they're always looking for a way. And so they want that data. The problem problem is, as we start to move ownership of the application infrastructure and the databases to end users or to developers, they're not well versed in the tactics to prevent data leaking or hacks, or even have some basic security infrastructure knowledge. And so a lot of times people are giving away the keys to the kingdom without realizing it. Right? When you go back and you look at the last few years, most of the major quote unquote data breaches or hacks aren't really hacks so much as having a big sign out front that says, hey, come on in, free data, come get it. It's people who have, I'm going to build this new infrastructure. I need a dev setup. Let me copy down the production data to a cloud instance that I just created. I don't even really know what I did to set it up. I just let the password as default, move the data over. Oh, there we go. Or I took backups of production, moved them over for my own test purposes, put them in an S3 bucket, didn't secure it, left them out there. These are the types of things that are happening. And I don't even think those are hacks, right? Those are just bad practices. But again, you've got this false sense of security when you're talking about managing environments where you've said, I've outsourced the management of my databases to firm X, but firm X doesn't, have any sort of concept how your developers are using and, managing that environment. And so it is a dangerous cross sections to be at. Now, again, as these things happen, the fine folks in the open source space, the different companies that are out there, are looking for new ways to monetize and to fix these problems. But they're doing it in ways that kind of prevent you from having all of the freedoms and openness that you might be used to. And so, you have to realize that as solutions to these problems come up, each company is going to approach this differently. But most companies that are in the commercial open source software space now are for-profit entities, and they're focused on shareholder value first and foremost. And that means that it is okay to create additional pain for you in the long term if it generates more revenue and quote unquote stickiness for them. And I've got to talk all on this later on. But as we've moved forward, we've seen more and more open source companies start to shift licensing tactics and start to shift how they're monetizing their software. And as you develop and deploy these databases, or even other open source components, you're going to find that not everything you deploy is going to be truly open anymore. And that means that right now, today, it might work. Tomorrow, you might have to pay a fee, or your rates may raise. And if you want to move out, it's going to be twice as hard, or maybe even impossible without ripping out that entire technology stack. And that's where you're going to get locked in. Now, this is where a lot of companies are seeing these trends, and they're saying, okay, we want some sort of portability. Okay. And, you're seeing that enterprises are opening up, and they're starting to build custom code and custom versions of applications to meet their specific needs, right? More and more companies are starting to fork, starting to take, code that's out there and build their own open source program offices to, build versions of that open source software. And this isn't a new trend. It's just accelerating because I'm seeing it in enterprise companies across the spectrum, right? Google, Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, they've all developed their own database versions in the past. We at the conference this year, we've got talks from Uber, for instance, talking about their database system that they built, and they've taken code from other places. I had on a podcast the CTO of Yonkovit, who talked about at Facebook how they built Cassandra and then gave Cassandra away. In fact, Facebook is one of the biggest open source companies in the world, even though they don't ship open source, right? Because they contribute so much, because they build so much that they need internally. And so open source software continues to be this innovation platform, right? And it's interesting because as more and more companies try to monetize it, now we're starting to see other companies say, well, we needed to do this other thing, so we're going to, fork it, do it on our own. And so it's quite standard to see that in the industry now. And part of this is also driven by this, need to build kind of your own personal internal cloud or mechanism to support those end users and those goals. Because you've got these needs that are very specific to your company, but you want to avoid having to lock into any one vendor. And so DBAs, are kind of like moving towards an SRE, but also a product manager space, right? And this shift is a very interesting shift because a lot of companies that I talk to, DBAs, are now like, yeah, we're building our own personal cloud now. We're managing thousands of systems. And so we're kind of the subject matter experts, not only on kind of the database cloud internally, but also on how to help developers do more and find that needle in the haystack. And those are the trends that are impacting you. Now, I hope you'll join me a little later on for my other sessions. You can check them out on YouTube after the conference. You can also check out the Haas Talks Foss, and I'm here to answer any questions.